The first time she saw it, she thought it was a trick of the light. Emma had been walking home from work, her heels clicking against the wet pavement as the rain drizzled down in a fine mist. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that danced like specters on the ground. She was tired, her mind foggy from a long day at the office, and she barely noticed the figure at first. It was only when she turned the corner onto her quiet residential street that she saw it, a woman standing beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp, her back turned to Emma. The woman was wearing the same coat, the same scarf, the same shoes. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The woman's posture was eerily familiar, the way she stood with her shoulders slightly hunched, her head tilted just so. Emma's heart began to pound as the woman slowly turned around. It was her. The same face. The same eyes. The same expression of shock and confusion. Emma stumbled backward, her bag slipping from her shoulder and hitting the ground with a dull thud. The doppelganger, because that's what it had to be, stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Its eyes were hollow, empty, like two black voids that threatened to swallow her whole. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The doppelganger didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching her with that same unnerving stare. Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Was she hallucinating? Had she finally cracked under the pressure of her job, her life, her loneliness? Before she could think of what to do, the doppelganger turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley across the street. Emma stood there for what felt like an eternity, her heart pounding in her chest, before she finally gathered the courage to pick up her bag and hurry home. The next day, Emma tried to convince herself it had been a figment of her imagination. She had been tired, stressed, and the rain had distorted her vision. That was all. But as she sat at her desk at work, typing away at her computer, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her coworkers chatted idly around her, oblivious to the unease that gnawed at her insides. And then she saw it again. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of someone standing in the hallway outside her office. She turned her head, her breath hitching in her throat, and there it was, the doppelganger. It stood perfectly still, its face expressionless, its eyes locked on hers. Emma's hands trembled as she pushed back her chair and stood up. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice louder than she intended. Her coworkers looked up, startled. "Emma? Are you okay?" one of them asked. Emma pointed to the hallway. "Don't you see her? She's right there." Her coworkers followed her gaze, but the hallway was empty. "See who?" another coworker asked, frowning. Emma's stomach churned. She stepped out into the hallway, her heart racing, but the doppelganger was gone. There was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever been there. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the day over and over again. She had seen it. She knew she had. But no one else could see it. What did that mean? Was she losing her mind? She got up and poured herself a glass of water, her hands still shaking. As she stood in the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned and saw the doppelganger standing in her backyard, its face pressed against the glass. Emma screamed, dropping the glass. It shattered on the floor, sending shards of glass skittering across the tiles. She backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but the doppelganger didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her with those hollow, empty eyes. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers fumbling over the buttons. "There's someone in my backyard," she shouted when the operator answered. "Please, send someone." The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the doppelganger was gone. They searched the backyard, the surrounding area, but found nothing. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. Nothing. "Are you sure you saw someone?" one of the officers asked, his tone skeptical. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I saw her. She was right there. She looked just like me." The officers exchanged a glance, and Emma knew what they were thinking. She was hysterical. Delusional. Crazy. The days that followed were a blur. Emma stopped going to work, too afraid to leave her house. She boarded up the windows, locked the doors, and kept the lights on at all times. But no matter what she did, the doppelganger always found a way to get to her. It appeared in the mirror when she brushed her teeth, its reflection staring back at her with a twisted smile. It stood at the foot of her bed at night, watching her as she tried to sleep. It followed her from room to room, always just out of reach, always silent. Emma's sanity began to unravel. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She spent hours pacing the house, muttering to herself, trying to figure out what the doppelganger wanted. Was it a ghost? A demon? A manifestation of her own fears and insecurities? She didn't know. All she knew was that it was real, and it was tormenting her. One night, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen and confronted the doppelganger as it stood in the living room, its head tilted to the side as if studying her. "Leave me alone," she screamed, brandishing the knife. "What do you want from me?" The doppelganger didn't respond. It simply smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent chills down Emma's spine, and took a step toward her. Emma's hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the knife. "Stay back," she warned, her voice breaking. But the doppelganger kept coming, its movements slow and deliberate. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her mind racing. She couldn't let it get to her. She couldn't let it win. With a cry of desperation, she lunged at the doppelganger, plunging the knife into its chest. But instead of blood, a thick, black ooze seeped from the wound, dripping onto the floor with a sickening plop. The doppelganger didn't flinch. It didn't scream. It just kept smiling as it reached out and wrapped its cold, bony fingers around Emma's throat. Emma gasped, struggling to breathe as the doppelganger's grip tightened. She clawed at its hands, but they were like iron, unyielding. Her vision blurred as the room spun around her, and she felt herself slipping into darkness. When Emma woke up, she was lying on the floor of her living room. The knife was still in her hand, but there was no sign of the doppelganger. She sat up, her head pounding, and looked around. The house was silent. Empty. She got to her feet, her legs wobbling beneath her, and stumbled to the bathroom. She needed to wash her face, to clear her head. But when she looked in the mirror, she froze. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. It was the doppelganger. Emma screamed, backing away from the mirror, but the doppelganger's reflection followed her, its hollow eyes filled with a malevolent glee. She turned and ran out of the bathroom, her heart pounding in her chest. But no matter where she went, the doppelganger was there. In every mirror. In every window. In every shadow. It had become a part of her. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's life became a living nightmare. She couldn't escape the doppelganger. It was always there, always watching, always waiting. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring. Her once pristine home became a cluttered, filthy mess, and her once vibrant personality faded into a hollow shell of what it had been. One night, as she sat on the floor of her living room, staring at the boarded-up windows, she heard a voice. "Emma." She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was hers, but it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from behind her. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw the doppelganger standing in the doorway. Its hollow eyes bored into hers, and its lips curled into a twisted smile. "It's time," it said, its voice a chilling echo of her own. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the doppelganger stepped toward her. She tried to move, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed, frozen in place as the doppelganger reached out and placed its cold, bony hand on her chest. And then, with a sudden, violent force, it pushed. Emma felt herself falling, tumbling into a void of darkness. She screamed, but no sound came out. She reached out, but there was nothing to grab onto. She was falling, falling, falling. When Emma opened her eyes, she was standing in her living room. The house was clean, the windows unboarded, the lights bright and cheerful. She looked down at herself and saw that she was wearing a fresh set of clothes, her hair neatly styled, her makeup perfectly applied. But something was wrong. She felt different. Like she was no longer in control of her own body. She tried to move, but her limbs moved on their own, as if guided by some unseen force. And then she saw it. In the mirror across the room, her reflection stared back at her. But it wasn't her. It was the doppelganger. Emma's heart raced as she realized what had happened. The doppelganger had taken over. It had pushed her out of her own body, trapping her in this strange, shadowy realm. She tried to scream, to fight, but it was no use. She was powerless. The doppelganger smiled, a cold, lifeless smile, and turned away from the mirror. It walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside into the bright, sunny day. Emma watched helplessly as the doppelganger walked down the street, blending in with the crowd. No one noticed anything unusual. No one suspected that the woman walking among them wasn't really Emma. But Emma knew. And she would spend the rest of her days trapped in the darkness, watching as the doppelganger lived her life, wore her face, and destroyed everything she had ever loved. The doppelganger walked with purpose, its steps confident and assured. It had waited so long for this moment, and now it was finally free. Free to live. Free to take over Emma's life. It entered the office building where Emma had worked, greeting her coworkers with a smile. They didn't notice anything different about her. To them, she was still the same Emma, friendly, hardworking, dependable. But the doppelganger knew better. It knew that it was nothing like the real Emma. It was something darker, something more sinister. As it sat at Emma's desk, typing away at her computer, it couldn't help but smile. It had won. It had taken everything from Emma, her life, her identity, her very soul. And no one would ever know. Emma floated in the darkness, her mind a jumble of fear and despair. She had no idea how long she had been there, hours, days, weeks. Time had no meaning in the void. She tried to scream, to cry, but no sound came out. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. And then she heard it, a faint, distant sound. It was a voice, whispering her name. Emma. She turned, her heart pounding, and saw a faint light in the distance. It was small, barely more than a pinprick, but it was there. Hope surged within her as she began to move toward the light. She didn't know what it was, but it was something. Something other than the endless darkness. But as she got closer, the light began to flicker, and she realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't a way out. It was the doppelganger, watching her from the other side. You can't escape, it whispered, its voice echoing in the void. You're mine now. Emma's heart sank as the light faded, leaving her once again in the darkness. She was trapped, forever at the mercy of the doppelganger. And somewhere, in the depths of the void, the doppelganger laughed.